Hi, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Just Crunch It. With us today, we have Dale W. Harrison, who is a consultant with Infoda Life Science Services. And Infoda works with some of the best clients and names you have probably heard of in the biotech space, such as Mammoth, Arc Bioscience. Dale is a builder, has over 3.5 decades of experience. I was just going through his profile. There's so much to unravel here. He was originally an experimental physicist who jumped into biotech mid career on the technology side, designing robotic DNA and protein synthesizers. Dale then went on to do a master's in economics. He has a focus on econometrics and has spent time in finance doing valuation analysis for mergers and acquisitions. He founded and ran a SaaS company and has extensive software development experience, somewhere close to 40 plus languages. I don't think most of the founders these days also can talk about that. And then Dale is also involved with the energy sector. He has an extensive exposure in how go to market works, how SaaS companies work, how early stage company hit growth stage. There's so much, honestly, that this could probably be a 10-hour chat, but I'm super, super, super excited to have him here, specifically given his background, which we have never had on the show before. Welcome to the show, Dale. How are you doing today?
Thanks. I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. Dale, we had some phenomenal conversation just before we hit the recording on how you see the world. And I think what I really like is that you have a very raw version of where we are, what people think to be true in the world when you are looking a SaaS founder sitting somewhere in San Francisco, how they imagine the world around them works and how this vertical is operating. It's very different from what's really happening. You have an extensive background in biotech, healthcare, biosciences, a lot of stuff that these tech founders today who now are getting more focused on may not really have an exposure to, right? Like, so I just want to start with like, what's your journey like? What is it that you do? How has your exposure to the biotech sector specifically been? And could you just in general comment on like what's being built there? Where are people going right and wrong? In general, like something, assume that we don't know anything. We are like 5-year-old kids who don't understand anything and go for it.
Yeah, so I have to say, I mean, most of my experience in biotech has been in two areas: what's called research tools, which are companies that build the sorts of products and devices that are used in research by scientists, and then the second area where I've had most of my experience in recent years has been in clinical diagnostics. So companies that are developing new diagnostic platforms for things like infectious disease testing or things like early detection of cancer. Um, and most of my work with these companies has been around commercialization. So I usually come in when the company is 4 or 5 years old. They've spent 4 or 5 years and 10 or 15 million developing a platform or a test or a product, and they're ready to now go to market with it. And so I'm usually coming in helping them with product launch, with standing up doing the initial stand up of the marketing team, helping to build out the sales team, working with them on things like strategic partnerships or distribution agreements. So all of the things associated with taking this thing, going to market with it, and being able to commercialize it and produce revenue.
Wow. So, like, okay, that gives me an overview, but I'm very interested. Like, what does that commercialization look like? And who are these companies, right? Like, what are they trying to build? Are we talking hardcore tech? Are we talking a merger of tech and bioscience? Are we talking like hardcore biotech? And what are these challenges that you're seeing specifically in this vertical? The precursor to this, again, being that the audience here on the show that we have, many of these are young people who have probably only built SaaS. They may not have the same insight as you have on the life science and the health domain. And we're seeing like a lot of change. So, somewhere sitting in a room in San Francisco, in an accelerator, probably like Y Combinator, they are thinking, oh, this sort of technology will apply as it is to the healthcare domain as well. And they often, like, it's a very costly mistake to make when they take a step in that direction and they realize a year later that okay, this is not the state of the world. Could you unravel that for us for the
Right.
healthcare domain?
So I'll give you a specific example. One of the clients I worked with, they had a platform for doing what's called agnostic infectious disease testing, meaning um, you could you could determine what someone was infected with without having to make a guess about about what the infectious agent was. So if you go to the doctor right now, the doctor looks at you and says, you have all the symptoms for flu, so I'm going to give you a flu test. Or you have all the symptoms for strep, so we're going to do a strep test. So in the current world, a doctor has to make a guess as to what you've got based on your symptoms and other risk factors, and then based on that guess, they will then try one test or another test. The disadvantage of that is there are cases where you need to be able to know the answer to what they're infected with, and what they can be infected with can be very obscure, and you need to know that answer quickly. And so this company's market was the solid organ transplant market. So think heart transplant, lung transplant, kidney transplant. So a lot of the majority of the fatalities post transplant occur because of uncontrolled viral infections. Um, and because you've suppressed the immune system ahead of the transplant, they don't have the ability to mount a good immune response. And so if they pick up a virus during that first few months after the transplant, they don't have any way to fight it off. And
Yeah.
so the physician has to know very quickly what this is. And the problem is that the symptoms are hard to guess. It could be a wide range of viruses. And so the idea of this test was you take a blood sample, you sequence all of the RNA and DNA in the sample, and then they had a technology platform, a software platform that would then take that data off the sequencer, push it up against a database of all known genetic sequences, and be able to identify everything that wasn't supposed to be there. And with a single test, without the doctor having to make a guess as to what the infectious agent was, the sequencing platform plus the software platform was able to literally produce a one-page report back to the doctor within about 72 hours that told them exactly what the patient was infected with. And that gives the doctors the ability to then know how to target a treatment for that patient that's unique to the infection. So this is a good example of both a hardware platform, because they had a special sort of sample preparation process, special chemistry they developed that then went on a genetic sequencer. They then took that data off the sequencer, pumped it into a bioinformatics platform that they had developed internally that was running in the cloud on Amazon and on Amazon Web Services, and then that software was able to uniquely process the data and then produce what was literally a one-page report back to the doctor. And so this is a good example, I would say, of kind of a hybrid platform that involves very sophisticated software, some sophisticated chemistry, some sophisticated platform technology. And then the challenge was, how to go to market with it. Taking that and convincing transplant surgeons to turn to this as an alternative to what they had traditionally been using, which was PCR, and to make the case for why this would allow them to make better, faster, life-saving decisions if they could use this approach versus the traditional approach. And so again, it was convincing physicians to take the risk of looking at an entirely new way of solving this problem. And again, that's often been the challenge in biotech and healthcare in general, is that these markets are extraordinarily conservative. Just because you think you've got something that's better, even if it's actually enormously better, better isn't good enough, because it has, because, this was one of the challenges with this particular company, was that their initial kind of go-to-market idea was to focus on how cutting edge and how revolutionary this was.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the early language was around this being you know absolutely on the cutting edge of science, the most advanced technology available. It was completely revolutionary approach to solving this problem, all of which was completely 100% true. And going in, my question to the CEO was, how likely is it that you're going to find a transplant surgeon who's willing to bet the life of their patient on the most revolutionary cutting edge thing that no one has ever used before?
Yeah.
Probably zero. That you have to convince them that that this is a low risk option. And talking about how revolutionary it is or how cutting edge it is not going to communicate that it's a low risk option. That what you've got to do is to communicate that the greatest risk you can possibly take is to not employ this technology.
Yeah.
And this is a very, very a significant inversion to the way technology people tend to think. Um, that you cannot talk about how cutting edge it is. You have to talk about how safe it is and how certain it is. And this is what makes selling into healthcare so fundamentally different than selling into almost any other industry out there, because there is this enormous resistance to new, not because they don't think it's better, but because they don't know for sure that it's better or that it will work, and they're making decisions where they're betting the life of their patient on this technology. And so, as a result, there's this kind of extreme conservatism and a significant reluctance to embrace new technology, no matter how good it is. And so, you can't use how good your technology is as the argument for why it should be adopted. You have to come at this with a very, very different, much more subtle approach, around risk mitigation and risk factors as opposed to the upside of the new technology.
Dale, so continuing on that, like it looks like the problem that you just talked about, that looks like a very hardcore medical problem, or like I understand the severity of what we are dealing with, like the consequences is pretty much like a human life, and it's way more uh like it needs way more of testing, way more of precision, like there's zero error margin. But there's also like another side of technological adoption which might not have happened in a space like healthcare, biotech, uh, biosciences, which is the traditional things that you see in tech companies, right? Like we just were talking about whether a biotech company has a CRM, are they open to adopting it? We like do data analytics and business analytics. Is there anyone within these bioscience biotech companies who's like looking at data analysis? Who is this person? Can you comment on the state of art as to like, is it fair to say that there is a market for someone who's thinking about traditional SaaS, all things AI, uh, to like tap upon something which is not necessarily, like where the end outcome is not as much as complicated as the example we just talked about, but could actually be
Right.
a software that maybe just makes the process efficient?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of companies that are attempting to deploy LLMs and AI and machine learning into healthcare. And again, I think the challenge is how do you prove that it works? At a level that is going to be convincing to people who don't know the technology. And the area where I see certainly machine learning starting to be introduced is you're starting to see platforms that produce so these diagnostic and medical platforms that are generating enormous amounts of data. And so this is a very good place to deploy things like machine learning if you're trying to pull very, very obscure signals out of very complex, very large blocks of data. And so for instance, I've got another client that I've worked with that's has a diagnostic for early detection of lung cancer based on what's called cell flow cytometry. And so a single run with a single sample produces about 15 or 20 million data points. And you've got to extract patterns out of that data to be able to come up with a diagnostic, a percentage probability that there's a malignant tumor in the lung of the patient based on the sample. And so there, you really almost have to turn to something like machine learning to be able to simply process that volume of data and be flexible enough to find the right signals in that data. Um, but interestingly enough, it's not something that the company talks about very much because it becomes almost an impediment to selling it rather than a reason to sell it. The focus is instead on the clinical trials, where it's like, this is a black box. We're not going to talk too much about what's inside the black box, but there's some really, really great AI in there, but we're not going to talk about it. We're instead going to simply say, when you use this black box, against real patients in the real world, here's our clinical trial data. It shows that it's highly effective at being able to reliably detect the presence of lung cancer at a very early stage in patients. and that this is how it compares with the other technologies on the market for doing lung cancer detection. So interestingly enough, even where it becomes a very critical component of the application, it's often not talked about simply um, you because you're raising risk factors in the minds of the buyer that does nothing to help you sell the product. Um, so you know, so so you see that sort of application. The other area is kind of on the commercial side because again, these are still companies that sell things, and so you still have
Yeah.
marketing, you have sales. You're trying to to do all, and this is something that I've been very involved in. Is is you still have to do all of the kind of data analysis and data analytics around the sales and marketing, especially as the company gets larger and more complex.
Yeah.
Um, and But certainly, I think even there in a lot of these biotech companies, they tend to be a decade or more behind the times compared to what you would typically see in say a Silicon Valley tech company. Um, so you still see a lot of companies that are reasonably large that either have no CRM or just a very minimal installation of a CRM or a hardly used CRM, and so even very basic tools tend to there's tend to be a multi-year lag in adoption.
Is this a good thing necessarily for a founder who's thinking about, oh, how do I actually go in and capitalize on this opportunity? Because that market is left behind. It should not be left behind in an ideal sense of the world. Who do they even go talk to? Like when you go look at a life science company, it's very undefined. Like the roles that are there are not necessarily the roles that they're used to. Probably you're not an insider, like you're an outsider who's trying to get in, which in itself makes the whole thing complex. And then there are all
Right.
of these challenges around the tech familiarity. Like how do you see that being solved?
I mean, I would say a lot of these companies are much more sales oriented versus is much more like a traditional sales led company versus a more marketing led company. Marketing tends to have a much more junior role. You tend to, almost never see CMO or chief marketing officer as a role in any of these companies. What you'll see is chief commercial officer, because, and you'll have someone who is much more focused on the sales organization, but their job is the overall commercialization of the product and all of the commercial aspects. And so you'll typically see a CCO, a chief commercial officer, as opposed to a CMO or a CRO or a VP of marketing or a VP of sales. Um, and and in many ways, I think marketing is probably significantly more secondary in these companies than you would typically see in other companies that are in areas of technology. Um, uh, and again, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that there's sort of very slow adoption of a lot of the the marketing and advertising and sales technology platforms that are available. You just tend to see a lot less of that used in this environment than you do in in many other industries, and certainly in most other tech oriented industries.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So, Dale, I know like you also had a lot of thoughts on, in general, like with your experience that you have on how SaaS companies operate. And one particular point that you made was very interesting to me personally. It was your comment on AI can be useful, but most AI solutions that are trying to actually come out in the market, at least from, like the sales point of view, MQL, SQL, and like closing an opportunity. You talked something about like no context with these AI products around pipeline stages. And that was very interesting. And I know that's probably going to also resonate with a lot of people in the audience. Could you elaborate more on what you were trying to communicate there and share a bit more?
So I mean, some of this is sort of a larger issue that I've it's an area of interest and an area that I've worked with clients on, which has to do with pipeline architecture. So in a lot of even pretty cutting edge tech companies, what you'll see is on the marketing side they'll have a thing they call the funnel with stages. on the sales side, there'll be the thing called a pipeline, also with stages. They're very disconnected. Um, the interface between those two is the MQL, the marketing qualified lead, which is an enormous point of contention between most sales and marketing organizations because typically as little as 2 to 5% of those MQLs ever become a sales qualified opportunity. And so sales now has to go through and you know literally 49 out of every 51 of those MQLs, they have to go through the work of disqualifying that it's not even worth pursuing by a full rep. And um, and so one of the things that you're starting to see come onto the market right now are a lot of AI and machine learning based scoring systems that are supposed to improve this. When you actually look at these, they tend not to improve it. They tend to be, you know, at best only marginally better than the approaches that people have been taking. And one of the arguments that I make is that there is a core flaw in whether you're using machine learning or AI to try to do your lead scoring or your stage scoring, because there's more to this than just scoring leads. Because even when it gets into sales, there's still this problem of when do we move it from the SDR to the AE? When does it move from just a sales accepted lead into a qualified opportunity worthy of uh, you know more intensive work by an AE? And so there's been I think a huge rush of AI tools on the market to try to solve this problem. And a lot of what I've seen on this is just not very good. And and part of this is I think a failure to understand what a unified sales pipeline uh, actually is to the business, and what it means, and then how do you actually go, what are you trying to accomplish when you move something, move a prospect from one stage to another stage along that pipeline. And uh, and again, the part of the disconnect here is that traditionally, I think sales organizations have looked at the pipeline stages as, once we've done certain things, then this person, this prospect automatically moves to the next stage. And so it's sort of a marker of internal busy work as opposed to a marker of the probability that this account is, or this prospect is likely to close and is worthy of spending more effort on. On the marketing side, you have a very different operating model, which is these, marketers imagine that they're mind readers and that these stages in the funnel supposedly represent some kind of internal mental state about intent. Um, you know, and it turns out that's equally useless because you can't read minds. And what you do, and on the sell side, what you're doing internally is not a reflection on what the customer is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And So the argument that I make is I think you need a unified pipeline that goes from, contact, the very, very, initial entry point on the marketing side all the way to close one, but treat that pipeline as an investment portfolio. So each one of those contacts is an investment opportunity. And the question is which of these investment opportunities should we be putting money in this week or this month? So it's a very financialized look at this, which also allows you to tie this whole process much more closely in with the business goals. And so the idea is that uh, if you were a financial manager managing an investment portfolio, you're going to look at the individual instruments in that portfolio, and you're going to think about them in terms of being different asset classes. You have different types of stocks, different types of bonds. You have sort of old growth companies, fast growth tech companies. You have different kinds of bonds. Stocks that you're holding because they're going to pay dividends versus stocks you're growing because they're going to escalate in value. So these are all different asset classes that lead you as an investment manager to decide to invest more in certain areas and less in other areas. So if you're a manager in sales and marketing, you're faced with the same thing. You've got this collection of prospects, in your database, in your CRM. And the question is, who are we going to make more or less investments into to try to maximize revenue coming out the other end. Because you know you know a low level marketing person you know can send an email blast to 100,000 names from a cold email list with
Yeah.
almost no effort. That's very cheap. When that SDR is, once you've tossed that MQL over to sales, and that SDR is trying to qualify them, you know, they can't qualify a million people with a punch of a key. They have to talk to them. And so now the cost to the company of interacting with each one of those prospects escalates
Yeah.
significantly. Once once they're qualified as an opportunity and they're passed over to an account rep, now that account rep is going to spend days, weeks, months trying to close that deal. So now the company's investment has escalated exponentially again. And so you're having to make investment decisions, you know, contact by contact, account by account, with what's in this portfolio. And so those lead stages um, really need to represent some estimation of the value that this collection of prospects have in terms of a greater level of investment by the company versus keeping them back and continuing to engage them at a lower investment level. And uh, and once you start to think of it in terms of portfolio management, and in terms of asset classes that that need to uh, that need to uh, have different levels of investment or deserve different levels of investment, you have a very different way of scoring these things. And and this is what I mean by context, is that if you think you're scoring your leads and MQLs based on intent,
Yeah.
you're going to be shoving data. You're going to be shoving completely different kind of data into the system and expecting completely different kind of outcomes. And again, the problem with a machine learning model is that the model doesn't know the world. The model simply knows the data that you're shoving in, and it's looking for correlations, and it'll spit that back out. And those correlations may or may not make any sense. And, and so but there's always this kind of implied model for how you think the world works that's baked into the software, that's baked into to those machine learning models, baked into the AI. And uh, and if you don't know what those models are, and if those models do not accurately reflect what you're trying to accomplish as a business, what you get are very bad results. And
Yeah.
and what you typically get out of this is um, is a significant level of what are called false positives, meaning the your decision making process, whether it's a manual human process or it's a machine learning process, that process will have a tendency to kind of reinforce biases around how you think the world works, and will tend to uh, have a large number of, in this case, prospects that it's telling you are now MQLs are in fact not MQLs, because you're operating in the wrong context with the wrong underlying operating model, for what you're trying to accomplish as a business, and for how these customers are actually working. And so I think that there's value in using machine learning models for this, but only as an end stage. I think you've got to come up with a model for how the world works. I think you've got to validate it by hand. And then once you've got that working, now you instantiate that within your machine learning model, so that you can automate it. And
Yeah.
so, and it's similar to, you know, if you want to build a factory to make cars, you have to design the car and make sure the car works and can be reliably assembled. And then you design the robotics to be able to manufacture a million of them. And
Yeah.
and so I think what a lot of these startups are doing is they're flipping that on its head. They want to design the robot first without ever thinking about designing the car or making sure that it can actually be built or that it makes sense.
Dale, so these are like a lot of very important and very uh like practical loopholes or gaps that I see in the process. And you were just talking about pretty much all the issues around commercialization, right? Like from marketing, sales, GTM, like performance, how are you evaluating things, what is the next thing you are doing to actually getting to the stage of a closed deal. If you had to like list down the top 2 3 problems that are of most importance out of everything you've talked about, because I don't think all of it can be solved in one go, what would they be? Like if you have to just stack rank that, okay, this is
I
like the
mean,
biggest friction. Yeah.
this is, I think the biggest friction point in go to market is is the the interface between marketing and sales. Um, you know, and that interface is embodied in the MQL. And you know, the MQL is essentially defined by the lead scoring system, whether it's a
Yeah.
manual points based lead scoring system like what you would set up, say, in HubSpot, or if you're using some sort of a machine learning or AI tool to do the lead scoring.
Yeah.
Um, and and so the deal is that if you could significantly improve your ability to predict which of these leads are likely to become close one,
Hmm.
um, you're going to be able to make a significant change in the organization because at the moment that prospect moves from marketing to sales, the the amount of cost to the organization for interacting with that prospect skyrockets and continues to skyrocket as it moves, from the SDRs into the full sales process.
Yeah.
And so, and so if you've got literally 98, 90, 96, 98% of those MQLs are coming into sales not ready to actually buy, because and this is the false positive problem, meaning that you have falsely flagged them as being ready to buy when in fact they're not.
Yeah.
Um, you know, those false positives are, once they get into sales, are extremely expensive to deal with.
Yeah.
And the problem is they don't know which 2% are the ones that are actually ready to buy. You've got to go through the same exact qualification process for all
For
of them
all.
because you don't have any way to really guess, because basically because your decision making systems have failed. You're sort of
Yeah.
now in a no man's zone where there are no decision making systems that are helping you. And I
Yeah.
think solving that problem would allow both marketing to run a lot leaner, and would allow the sales organization, which is far more expensive than the marketing organization typically. In most
Yeah.
companies, that sales organization is the most expensive investment that company makes.
Yeah.
And if you could cut the sales organization in half, and still get 95% of your revenue, it'd be a huge win. And
Yeah.
and a lot of that I think is driven by the MQL. And again, the problem isn't the MQL. The MQL is always going to exist because it is the it is that stage where marketing hands off to sales. Whatever you want
Yeah.
to call it, it's still that stage. And so the challenge is really up in marketing. What's the lead scoring mechanism that you're going to use to be able to decide that it's ready to hand off to sales?
Dale, I want to switch gears here. So, as you're talking about all of these problems, and I'm thinking about the conversations I've had in the past, and I don't think we discussed this as a precursor to this call, but you have spent, like, let's say the maximum experience you have today is in the biotech space, right? Like, and I don't remember where it exactly came up, but it came up in one of our episodes in the past where we were discussing if AI is actually gonna, like let or empower people to skip a step. So if biotech has left, let's say, a decade behind in adoption of certain tools, could we like just bypass that and reach the same stage where these companies eventually that have gone through, like adopting all the latest technologies that have come up in the last decade are going to be eventually? And think of it as to what crunch does, right? Like, so I can talk about my tool with much more clarity here. um, we basically go to any business leader and we go in and say, hey, you always traditionally look at a dashboard, you're looking at these graphs, you have tons of questions in your head, and the only way you can answer these questions, if the chart is not already in front of you, is to go in and ping someone in the data team. The minute you ping a data team person, they're going to write queries for it, look at whatever is the right table, wherever is the raw data, make sense out of it, clean it. They will do whatever doctoring needs to be done on top, and then come back with a finished report to you. except that when they come back with a report, you again have new questions, and that cycle keeps on going on. There's like a pile, like there's like a backlog of all the queries that have come in from executives. The senior executives keep getting the answers faster, and overall the entire organization is suffering. Now what we are trying to do with our co-pilot is sort of go to this leader and go in and say, hey, why do you even have to go to an agent? It was not possible in the past. Why do you even have to go to a data person? It was not possible in the past for an AI to do it. Today it's possible if you like actually doctor it properly. And then suddenly we are seeing all of these operation heads, inventory management heads, warehouse managers come up with use cases like, oh, I want to forecast what is the demand for my product going to be. I want to forecast if my stock in a particular store location is good or not. I want to see what are people talking about it, right? Like you can pair it with any type of data that you have, consumer sentiment, uh, like sales forecast, sales prediction, and so on. So this sector is something I relatively have a more grasp on. Now, when you talk about biotech, everything health science, like all the uh, like life sciences division, the entire bit of it, like do you see a product like this where an AI is actually helping you make decision or helping you even analyze data? Maybe that is not gonna like recommend an end-to-end decision, and we are still not talking about very critical like life threatening or like where a life depends on the outcome sort of a scenario. Do you see any use
Well,
case in that space that like makes sense or that you see is probably uh,
I mean, certainly within that space, I think you've got to divide it between um, things that get baked into the product that are going to be used to make healthcare decisions with versus things that get baked into the organization that helps the company run better.
yeah,
So those are very, I mean, it can be very similar underlying technologies, but very, very different use cases.
sure,
And and I think that the use case for using this technology to do decision making for patients is still a ways off.
yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of companies that are attempting to do this, but again, what you see is an enormous amount of conservatism within the
And
healthcare
that's fair,
community.
that's fair.
Yeah, but but the second use case is you know to help companies do what they're having to do as a business faster, more efficiently, better. And there I think there's a possibility. Um, Although again, I think certainly within a lot of biotech and healthcare companies, the underlying infrastructure in terms of systems in place, in terms of the quality of their data on the business side, because again, these are like hardcore technology companies on the science side, and so um, there I think there is a kind of a deprecation of of by founders of these companies in terms of thinking about because often they will come out of research, and and these are scientists that are founding and running these companies, and they see the science as hard and the business as you know something that monkeys could do, and and so uh there is, I think there's less of a willingness to make the investment in the kind of systems and processes and infrastructure on the business side that is almost a precursor to being able to deploy much more sophisticated layer of technology like machine learning and
Why is that? Why is that?
AI. Again, I mean, I think it's it's an assumption that um, you know that the hard stuff is the science, the hard stuff is the product. And again, I think you see some of this even on the with SaaS companies, where if you have developer founders, so founders that really know the development environment and the technology side, they will be so focused on the details of the product that they lose track of what they have to do to be able to present that
Yeah,
product
I
in a sellable way to the market. And 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 I think you see that same sort of thing times 100 in a lot of biotech and healthcare companies.
agreed. So Dale, I think like I get what you're talking about, but I'm wondering here, there are always these outliers, leaders who are very open to like adopting new things, who have understood that okay, like people may say that monkeys can do business, but it is actually equally challenging, or maybe if not more, and I can't comment on that space, but like today in this world of tech, and like software products, building has become like the easiest thing. Distribution has become the most
Right.
challenging
The
thing to
hard thing.
achieve. So
Well, I mean,
I
if you wanted
like,
to define it, well, if you wanted to define an ICP in the biotech and health space to sell, to sell a high tech product
yeah, who's
into,
open to like experimentation?
I
Who's
mean,
that? How do we
here's
identify that?
here's the answer: never ever sell to first time founders. I don't
Okay.
care how many PhDs they've got, how many MDs they've got after their name. Never ever sell to first time founders because what they know is the science and the medicine. They don't know the business because they haven't been, they have not successfully gone through that process yet.
Okay, so
They
second time
think they know,
founders.
but they don't know.
So
So,
second time founders,
so
but what are they doing? Like, are
look
they
for,
using
yeah.
some
I
other
mean,
tools?
look for people who've started two or three companies successfully already, because then they're going to really, really understand how hard it is to sell things, how hard it is
Yeah.
to run kind of the business side of the business, and I think that my experience has been those sorts of founders are the ones that really deeply get the importance of uh, you know of of deploying these sorts of technologies within the business, because they understand that the really hard thing is is selling it, not making
Are,
it.
are, are there other identifiers like, hey, they're probably using an Excel table, or they have a team of 10 analysts? Go talk to them. Like, this is a good definition. They have this function that is specifically created for go to market. Maybe talk to them. Like, is there anything like that you've come across?
um, I mean, it's hard. I mean, in general, you have the question of sort of how survivable is the company. As a general rule, if you're looking at therapeutics companies, so companies developing drugs, extremely high mortality rate on those companies, and extremely long time to revenue. So it's not uncommon to see 99.9% of those companies eventually fail. It's not uncommon to see these companies take 10, 15, even 20 years to come to market with a product. That's a very different type of customer, that spends almost the entire life of the company in the R&D phase, not in the commercialization phase. One of the reasons I really like diagnostics is that it's sort of a middle ground, that you can come to market and be profitable within 2 to 4 years for you know 5% of the cost of bringing a drug to market, and you've got a pretty high chance of succeeding. And so these companies are moving into commercialization a lot faster. The third sector in the market is research tools, which again is where I started, originally in biotech. So these are making tools for scientists. The problem with that is no one has money, and so if you've got a company who's primarily selling things to researchers as opposed to medical personnel, healthcare providers, you've got the problem of you're trying to sell to the poor, because the amount of money in research is a fraction of 1% of the amount of money sloshing around in the healthcare system. And so, so those tend to make poor customers. The other areas are medical device and then sort of healthcare systems of different sorts. And certainly, if you're selling systems into healthcare, meaning, um, you know, for instance, patient record systems is one example. Most of these companies that succeed, start out as very big companies before they even go into that market, simply because it's like an enterprise sales process. It's like selling, it's like selling to the Fortune 100. It's a long, slow, complex, highly specialized sales process, and because you're selling into medical organizations as opposed to trying to convince a clinical lab director or a treating physician to adopt this technology. So so there are very different profiles in terms of risk level, time to profitability, how quickly they move into commercialization, and then how complex the commercialization process is, for that company. And uh, and so you I think you have to be acutely aware of, is this a research tools company, a diagnostic company? sort of a broad healthcare provider? Is it a medical device company, or is it a therapeutics company? So kind of five different categories there, and each one of those is going to have a highly unique set of characteristics in terms of how they look at commercialization, what the hard problems are for them, and then how much money they're going to have. Because again, there's insane profits for therapeutics, but also incredibly high risk to get the product approved, regulatory approval to get the product on the market. Um, you know, Pretty good profits for medical device, but also a very very long approval cycle on that to get regulatory
Yeah.
approval. Diagnostics, you can get regulatory approval in a year to 18 months in many cases, um, and so much faster time to market. Research tools, no regulatory environment at all, but no one has any money, so the profit margins are very thin.
And
so
and
uh,
w-
so it's
w- w-
important to sort of understand the commercial environment around each of these different types of companies.
what about companies that are, let's say, shipping medicines, and we do not even get into medicine production? Like, we're talking about how's this medicine being shipped? Like, do they use the same sophistication in their technology in planning which store should have how much of a particular variety of medicine,
Well,
the
and
way
again, that's
Nike is doing to their shoes? Like, I don't know.
right. I mean, and some of that is what I would call infrastructure stuff. And again, the closer you are to touching a patient. So, if you're doing any kind of analysis that has to do with having, the right drug selected at the right time at the right location, you're starting to get close to the patient, which means you're starting to get deeper into regulatory territory, and the risk of the risk to the company if something goes wrong, starts to get much higher.
Dale, double
Versus,
down on this for me. Double down on this for me. Like, so if I'm going and saying that, hey, this particular variety of painkiller in, let's say, this 35th Street store in New York is going to run out of stock by Sunday, so replenish it. Like, where is the regulatory issue?
um, I mean, and with something like that, I mean, because you're really talking about the consumer market there, which is a bit different. I
Okay.
was thinking more in terms of, um, there are these platforms, hardware and software platforms that are widely used in hospitals that
Oh,
hold, enormous numbers of drugs, and you have to go in and basically have this device dispense the correct drug, for the particular patient, and this is done by healthcare professionals, within the organization. Um, there you're very, very close to the patient.
yeah.
Um, the what you're talking about is really, really almost retail distribution, kind of retail logistics,
Yeah.
which is again going to be a lot further. It's going to be a lot further away from the patient, a lot further away from healthcare. There's going to be less value in that market, simply because the profit margins that you know, you're going to be in the supply chain for a certain level of maximum profit margin and maximum
Yeah.
revenue for the end product. And, that revenue and those margins are going to be a lot thinner in that environment. And so your ability to capture a fraction of the profit margins within that environment, within that supply chain, is going to be very thin compared to something that is directly impacting a physician's decision about treatment, about patient care. um, so as a general rule, and this is a very very broad rule, but it generally applies. The closer you get to putting something inside the body of a patient, the higher the profit margins are, the greater the revenue potential is, and the greater the risks are,
Yeah.
and the greater the level of regulatory involvement. So a drug, is the highest. A medical implant, next to highest. A some sort of a monitoring or measuring device, that's sort of that's not a part of. It's not like a joint that's functional. Is kind of the next layer down. Taking a sample from the patient and doing a diagnostic on it, you're still up close, but you're not putting something in the patient, and so now it's lower margins, less revenue potential, but much lower risk. And
Yeah.
and so just the general rule anywhere within the healthcare environment is the further away you get from putting something in a patient or making a decision about what might get put into a patient, because again, the problem with diagnostics is that the information from the diagnostic test is going to be used by a physician to define a treatment protocol, and that treatment protocol will involve putting something in the patient, and or taking something out of the patient, and so uh, so the closer you get to something that involves putting something in a patient, the higher the margins are, the higher the revenue and profit potential is, but the higher the risk are, and the higher the level of regulatory involvement. So if you're doing sort of supply chain analysis for CVS, um, that's going to be much further away from the patient, many more steps away from putting something in a patient, and but it's also going to be
Low margin.
lower, lower margins, lower overall value within that supply chain, lower potential, but a lot lower risk as well. And because it's lower risk, it means you've got a greater opportunity for acceptance of new technology, I think. Where,
Yeah.
you know, if you're on the cutting edge of putting stuff inside a patient, you know, you you know, this is where these risk decisions really come into play. There's a lot of heavy thinking about why should we do something different than what we've already been doing. We know what we've been doing isn't perfect, but but you know, at least we know what it is. Where if we do something new, we're not really going to know whether it really works until we do it, and that's a pretty high risk to take. And so there's this sort of tendency to always keep doing what you were previously doing because it's the proven thing. And the other issue in here too that I think is important is um, that if I if I use an established protocol and the patient doesn't make it, doesn't improve, I'm sort of blameless because I use the established protocol. I use the collective wisdom of everybody in healthcare, you know, thinking around the best way to treat this condition. If I use something brand new and the patient improves, I don't really get any credit for that because sort of the expectation is, whatever you do, the patient should improve. But
Yeah.
if I use something new that no one else is using and the patient doesn't make it,
The risk goes
now
in you.
an enormous amount of risk comes directly onto me as opposed to being, you know, as opposed to if I do something and the patient doesn't make it, but it's a widely accepted standard of care, the risk associated, the blame associated with it not working is now diffused across all of healthcare as opposed to fully concentrated on me because I did something different. And so
Yeah.
that sort of diffusion of risk or concentration of risk in decision making, is a huge driver of how willing different aspects of healthcare are to take on new technologies and new approaches, and
Yeah.
why you see this sort of very very conservative approach to things.
Dale, we,
And I'll give you
like,
I'll give you a specific example. The early work on RNA based vaccines goes back to the 1980s.
yeah.
That there were trials of these vaccines 20 years ago in the early 2000s. They did not come on market until COVID, because COVID is the first of the RNA vaccines. And the reason why was that a traditional vaccine was going to take 5 to 7 years to bring to market, if it worked at all. And so there was this willingness to take risks because the risk of not doing it was so much greater, given
Yeah.
given the circumstances of the pandemic. And so so in the places where you see this sort of quantum leap in tech, in you know technology within healthcare, it's usually driven by something else, where that quantum leap represents the least high risk option.
Black swan
That
events.
all
Yeah.
your other all your other options are worse, or higher risk. And and if you're trying to introduce new products into that environment, I think you've got to think in those terms. Is that how can I make the case that this is the you know that this is a risky option, but it's the least risky option you can take. And
Got it.
I'll give you a very very specific example. So um, so the client that I had worked with that had the infectious disease diagnostic for transplant patients, very high risk environment. Um, uh, their original thinking was the current standard of care is PCR, so which has been around for a long time, and is widely used for doing infectious disease testing. But it's like there's one PCR test for each individual virus, and you got to know which test to order, which means the physician has to make a guess that it might be this, or this. So let's order these three tests. And so the idea here was that a single test can see everything, and they had the data to prove it. So so this wasn't a question mark. This was they had the clinical data to prove it. So the idea was we're going to market this as the replacement for PCR. And and my argument when I came in to help them with the product launch was this is a super high risk strategy because PCR is so established and it's so well accepted. And even though it's not perfect, its failings are so well understood that everyone's comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And if you're asking them to sort of abandon something that they're comfortable with for something that in at least in their minds is unproven, even though we had the data that shows that it worked, um, this is a huge mental risk for physicians to take. And so my argument was what you need is to market this as the hat that you pull a rabbit out of. That basically, because what will happen is in almost all cases, the physicians can make a guess as to what the patient's infected with, can order some tests, they'll get a positive result, and they can, and they can move forward.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of patients where they will go through every known test, every known PCR test, and they still don't know what the infection is. And the deal is, this is what you turn to when the established technology fails you. When you can't get an answer from the established technology, this is the hat you can always pull a rabbit out of, that it will
Yeah.
100% of the time work. And so you sell it as a fail-safe backup to the primary approach. um, and then the argument becomes the riskiest thing you can do is to not take advantage of this technology, because
Yeah. That's
you're going to hit a case where the existing technology won't give you an answer. And if you didn't buy this technology, you've now willfully chosen to not get an answer to the problem. And
yeah.
but by buying this, you have now lowered your overall risk. And so you completely invert the risk argument from trying to explain why it's not as risky as it seems, to making the argument that the riskiest thing you could do is to not deploy this
Yep.
technology.
Yep.
And I think
100%.
that's the kind of thinking on the commercial side that you've got to adopt, you know, if you want to try to sell into this market.
Yep. Dale, very, very helpful insights. Like I have so many questions popping up in my head, and I don't think it would be fair to continue chatting here because this would probably be the longest episode I have ever recorded. But I have one final question to you. Thank you so much, by the
Okay.
way, for that. I think the last 20-30 minutes, if I just send that clip to a founder who's exploring biotech space, they would probably forever thank you, as long as they're building, because it's a very good
Well, I'm always
synthesis of yeah.
and
And
I'm
then
always looking for new clients. I mean, this is what I do is help
yeah,
companies
I'm sure
exactly in this area.
I'll put it in the description as to how people can reach out to you as well. But Dale, the final question is, as you look back on your career, look back on where we are in tech, everything around, right? Is there any learning you'd like to share with us? Might be related to what we've talked about, might be absolutely tangential, that's fine. But in general, I make sure I ask my guests this, what is that two, three things that you'd share as learnings on a closing note?
Um, question everything. So here's the thing. Here's the thing I always say. I have never ever seen a startup fail because they didn't have enough great ideas. They didn't have enough great IP, because they didn't have enough PhDs or engineers. I've never seen a company fail because they didn't have enough money. They fail because they don't have enough customers. and they don't have enough customers because they make assumptions about the world that are not true, and they never question those assumptions, and they never go out into the world and validate those assumptions before they make the investments. Yeah, and this is as equally true for venture capital backed companies as as pre-seed startups. There are lots and lots of VC companies that fail, not because the technology failed. I mean, how many startups have you seen fail where they never could get the thing to work? Never. They always could get the thing to work. What they couldn't get was anybody to buy it. And so that problem is really from making assumptions about what people want and about how people are going to evaluate this as a potential option to solve their problems. And you just move forward with these assumptions, you know, and you build something that you cannot sell because there isn't a market for it, not because it doesn't work and not because it's not great and not even because it's not better than anything else out there. It can be better than anything else out there and still not be good enough to replace what's out there.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, is how you have to be extremely brutal in terms of questioning your own assumptions and then doing the work to disprove your assumptions. Don't go out to try to prove your assumptions, because again, this is the difference between science and pseudoscience. A scientist attempts to disprove their assumptions. They have a theory, and we're gonna have some, we're gonna produce some hypotheses from the theory about what we should expect to see in the world. We're now going to do experiments, and what we're looking for are data from the experiments that disprove the hypothesis, that tell us that this hypothesis is incorrect, but tell us that the theory is flawed. So you're looking to disprove your ideas. Where, if you look at, say, a fortune teller or an astrologer, they're going to give you all the times they were right. Because instead of trying to disprove what they say, they're trying to prove what they say. And again, this is a big problem with startups and with marketers, I think, is that there's a tendency to want to not examine your assumptions and to use the data to try to prove that you were correct, as opposed to use the data to find all the ways that you were not correct. Because you know no one no one ever failed because they were too correct. They failed because they were too wrong about something that they were convinced they were correct about.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, is that, um, just just because it's a great idea, well executed, don't assume that there's a market for you, and don't assume that there's a company to be built around it.
Yep. Love it. Dale, thank you so much. This was as engaging as I thought it would be. And like myself, I have new light bulbs going on in my head around things that I may not have like thought about, or like at least fulcrums I have not like evaluated. But that's like the name of the game. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you.
Oh, this is
And I
this is
hope
always fun. I enjoy talking about these things.
awesome. Thank you so much, Dale. Have a good day.